If you walk through central London today, you will see monuments everywhere. Statues of Churchill standing defiant. Memorials to the RAF pilots who saved Britain from the Nazis. The narrative is simple and clean. Britain stood alone against fascism. Britain bankrupted itself to save the world. Britain spent every penny it had to defeat Hitler. That is the story we are taught. That is the myth we believe. But there is another ledger. There is a different balance sheet. And in that ledger, Britain did not go broke fighting the war. Britain made someone else pay for it. Britain ran up a tab on a credit card that belonged to its poorest subjects. And when the bill came due, Britain refused to pay. This is the story of the sterling balances. This is the story of the greatest financial heist in modern history. Let me take you back to September 1939. Europe is plunging into war. The German war machine is rolling across Poland. Britain declares war on Nazi Germany. Churchill promises blood, toil, tears, and sweat. But behind the speeches and the propaganda, there is a cold financial reality. Britain is a small island. It does not have the resources to fight a global war. It needs oil from America. It needs steel from Canada. It needs food from Australia. It needs rubber from Malaya. And it needs soldiers, millions of soldiers from India. Modern war is not won with courage alone. It is won with cash. And Britain is about to run out of cash. In 1939, the British Empire was the largest economic bloc on Earth. It controlled a quarter of the world's landmass. It ruled over 500 million people. The empire was bound together by trade, by the Royal Navy, and by a currency system called the sterling area. This system was elegant and ruthless. Every colony from Lagos to Calcutta had to hold its national reserves in British pounds. They were not allowed to hold gold. They were not allowed to hold used dollars. They had to bank in London. The financial heart of the empire was the Bank of England, and that gave Britain a power more dangerous than any battleship. It gave Britain control over the money supply of half the world. When the war began, Britain started spending money it did not have. It bought weapons from the United States. It shipped steel across the Atlantic. It fed its armies in North Africa and the Middle East. At first, Britain paid in gold. The vaults of the Bank of England were stripped bare. Bars of gold were loaded onto ships and sent to America to pay for tanks and planes. But the gold ran out faster than anyone expected. By the spring of 1941, Britain was technically insolvent. It could not pay its bills. The American ambassador in London sent a telegram back to Washington. The message was clear. Britain is broke. If we do not help them, they will lose the war. This is where the looting began. The British government realized something critical. They could not force America to give them free supplies, but they could force their colonies to do so. The crown jewel of the empire was India. India was not just a source of soldiers. It was a massive industrial economy. It produced textiles, steel, food, and raw materials. The British war machine needed these goods desperately. But Britain did not have the money to pay for them. So the Treasury in London invented a mechanism that was both ingenious and criminal. It was a mechanism that would drain India of its wealth while making it look like a fair trade. Here is how the system worked. When the British Army needed rice or uniforms or steel from India, they placed an order with the government in Delhi. The Indian government paid the local producers in rupees. The factories ran, the workers were paid. The goods were shipped to the front. But the British government did not pay India back in rupees. They did not pay them back in gold. They did not pay them back in dollars. Instead, they made a bookkeeping entry in a ledger at the Bank of England. They credited India's account with pounds sterling. On paper, this looked legitimate. India was selling goods. Britain was paying for them. India was accumulating a massive savings account in London. These were called the sterling balances. By the end of the war, India held 1.3 billion pounds in these accounts. In today's money, that is over $300 billion. It was the largest transfer of wealth in history. On paper, India had become a creditor nation. Britain had become a debtor. India had lent Britain the money to fight the war, and Britain owed India a fortune. But there was a trap so brutal it would define the next 50 years. The British government declared that these sterling balances were blocked. India was not allowed to withdraw the money. It could not convert the pounds into dollars. It could not buy gold. The money was frozen in London. Britain had taken real goods, real labor, real food from India, and it had paid for them with an IOU that could never be cashed. It was theft by accounting. Think about what this means on the ground. The Indian government had printed millions of rupees to pay its producers. The money supply in India exploded. But the goods, the rice, the cloth, the steel were being shipped out of the country. There was too much money chasing too few goods. That leads to one thing: inflation. Hyperinflation. The price of food in India skyrocketed. A bag of rice that cost 10 rupees in 1940 cost 50 rupees by 1943. The poor who lived hand to mouth found that their wages could not buy a single meal. This was not an accident. It was not an accident. This was not a side effect. This was a calculated policy. The British government knew exactly what it was doing. The architect of this system was John Maynard Keynes. Yes, that Keynes, the hero of liberal economics. The man who taught the world about stimulus spending and full employment. Keynes was an advisor to the British Treasury during the war. He understood the mechanics of inflation better than anyone alive. He knew that printing money in India to pay for the war would cause prices to explode. He called it a forced transfer of value. He knew that the consumption of the Indian peasant was being reduced to fund the consumption of the British soldier. He knew that people would starve, and he approved the policy anyway, because in the ledger of empire, Indian lives did not count as much as British victory. The most horrifying result of this system was the Bengal famine of 1943. We are told that the famine was caused by a cyclone. We are told it was caused by the Japanese invasion of Burma. Those were factors. But the primary driver was inflation. The British government was buying up all the rice in Bengal. They were shipping it to the army in the Middle East. They were exporting it to feed British troops in Ceylon. The price of rice rose so high that the Bengali peasant could not afford to eat. 3 million people died. They did not die because there was no food. They died because the financial system had priced them out of existence. While corpses piled up in the streets of Calcutta, the sterling balances in London kept growing. Every sack of rice taken from a starving village added another line to India's bank account. It was blood money. Let that number sink in. 3 million dead. And the British government did not stop the policy. Winston Churchill was informed of the famine. His response was to ask why Gandhi had not died yet if the famine was so bad. He dismissed the suffering with a racist joke. He said Indians bred like rabbits. Churchill viewed the debt Britain was accumulating to India not as a legitimate obligation, but as an absurdity. He could not believe that Britain, the master, should owe money to India, the servant. The racial logic of empire distorted the financial logic of debt. In Churchill's mind, it was India's duty to sacrifice for Britain. The idea that Britain should repay that sacrifice was unthinkable. By 1945, the war was over. The Nazis were defeated. Britain had won, but the financial reckoning had arrived. Britain owed its colonies over £3 billion. That debt was larger than Britain's entire GDP. It was a crushing burden. The leaders of India, Egypt, and other colonies expected to be paid. Jawaharlal Nehru looked at those balances as the seed capital for a new India. He planned to use the money to build dams, factories, and schools. He believed that Britain, having forced India to sacrifice so much, would honor its debt. He was wrong. The betrayal began almost immediately. In the negotiations that followed the war, Britain made it clear it had no intention of paying the full amount. Leading British politicians argued that the debt was unfair. They said that Britain had fought the war to defend the empire, including India. Therefore, the colonies should have contributed freely. They called the debt monstrous. Winston Churchill wanted to default outright. He drafted memos suggesting that Britain should present a counterbill to India for the cost of defense. Imagine the audacity. After causing a famine, after inflating the currency, after taking billions in goods, Britain now argued that India should cancel the debt as a thank you. It was extortion dressed up as gratitude. The new Labour government under Clement Attlee realized that a total default was impossible. If Britain simply refused to pay, the pound would collapse. No one would ever trust the City of London again, so they needed a settler plan. They needed to default without calling it a default. They needed to steal the money slowly, and they had help. The United States was watching closely. In 1946, Britain was negotiating a massive loan from America. The Americans were worried. They looked at the sterling balances and feared that if they loaned Britain money, Britain would just use it to pay back India. The Americans wanted the debt written off. They wanted the balances canceled so Britain could become a strong ally in the Cold War. The British Treasury designed a compromise that was, in reality, a slow-motion theft. They told India the money would remain blocked. India could not withdraw the principal. Britain would release a small trickle of cash each year, just enough to buy essential imports, not enough to develop the country. They treated the debt not as an obligation but as a favor. India was given an allowance. It was humiliating. It was economically crippling. And it was legal, because Britain controlled the rules of the game. Sovereignty is solvency, and India did not have sovereignty over its own money. In 1947, India finally won its independence. The British flag came down in Delhi, but financial independence did not come with political independence. The new Indian government was desperate for capital. The country was broken by partition. Millions of refugees were fleeing across new borders. Industries were backward. Agriculture was stagnant. And India technically had the money to fix these problems. Over £1 billion sat in London. But when Indian finance ministers went to the Bank of England to ask for their money, they were met with cold smiles. The British said the release of funds would be controlled. India could only access a fraction of the total each year. The excuse was that Britain's economy was too fragile. If they paid India back too quickly, the pound would collapse, and that would hurt everyone, including India. It was a classic abuser's logic. The victim was told to protect the abuser for their own good. India had no choice. The global financial system was rigged in Britain's favor. India had no other source of hard currency. They were forced to accept the drip feed, but Britain had a darker plan. If they could not cancel the debt, they would devalue it away. In 1949, the British government made a shocking announcement. They devalued the pound sterling by 30% against the U.S. dollar. Overnight, the currency collapsed. For Britain, this was painful but necessary to boost exports. For India, it was catastrophic. India's reserves were held in pounds. When the pound lost 30% of its value, India lost 30% of its savings in a single day. The machinery they wanted to buy from America became 30% more expensive. The gold they wanted to buy was out of reach. Economists have calculated the loss. It was an instant vaporization of wealth. Britain had effectively wiped out a third of what it owed without paying a single penny. It was a default by currency manipulation, and they did it more than once. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, inflation in Britain ate away at the real value of the balances. The interest rate Britain paid on the accounts was far below the rate of inflation. Every year the money sat in London, it became worth less. It was like putting ice in the sun. Britain waited for the debt to melt. While India struggled to feed its people in the 1950s, Britain was enjoying a post-war boom. The National Health Service was created in 1948. Council housing was built across the country. The British standard of living rose steadily, and this recovery was subsidized by the blocked sterling balances. By forcing the colonies to hold pounds, Britain ensured constant demand for its currency. It allowed Britain to live beyond its means. It allowed the government to fund generous social programs without raising taxes. The cheap goods extracted during the war kept inflation low. The average British family in the 1950s enjoyed a quality of life that was artificially supported by wealth stolen from the East. The story of the sterling balances destroys the myth that empire was a financial burden on Britain. Apologists often claim that Britain spent more on the colonies than it got back. They point to the cost of administration and defense. But the sterling trap proves the opposite. In Britain's moment of greatest crisis, the empire was a cash cow. It was a resource to be drained. The economist Utsa Patnaik has done groundbreaking research on the total wealth extracted from India over the colonial period. When you factor in trade surpluses, taxes, and mechanisms like the sterling balances, she estimates Britain drained $45 trillion from India. That number is almost incomprehensible. It is 17 times the current GDP of the United Kingdom. That explains why India, one of the richest regions in the world in the 18th century, became one of the poorest by the 20th century. It explains how a small island in the North Atlantic became a global superpower. The wealth was not created in Britain. It was taken from India. The legacy of this theft is still visible today. The infrastructure gap. The poverty that plagued India for decades after independence. Imagine if India had accessed that £1.3 billion in 1947. Imagine if they had bought the best technology from America and Germany. Imagine if they had built high-speed rail and modern universities in the 1950s. The trajectory of Asian history would have been radically different. Instead, India was forced to beg for aid from the World Bank and the IMF. They accepted humiliating loan conditions. They borrowed money at high interest rates, and their own money sat locked in London, earning negative real interest. The sterling trap also reveals the cynicism of the post-war international order. The institutions created after World War II, the IMF and the World Bank, were supposedly designed to create a fair global economy. But in reality, they were designed to protect the interests of creditor nations. When Britain negotiated the release of the balances, they often attached strings. They pressured India to spend the money on British goods. Even though British machinery was outdated and expensive, India was forced to buy British because their funds were in pounds. This was a double theft. First, Britain took the money. Then they forced India to spend it on uncompetitive British products. It subsidized British industry twice. It took decades for the issue to be resolved. The balances were released so slowly, and their value eroded so much by inflation and devaluation, that by the time India received the final payments, the money was worthless. The seed capital Nehru had dreamed of had turned to dust. The great transfer of wealth never happened. The British government never apologized. They never acknowledged they had defaulted on a moral and financial obligation. The narrative in Britain remained that they had graciously granted independence. The financial reality that they had looted the country on the way out was buried in technical documents. Today, when we talk about the relationship between the global North and the global South, we see it through the lens of aid. We see rich countries giving charity to poor countries. But the history of the sterling balances reminds us that the flow of wealth has always gone the other way. The poor subsidized the rich. The starving Bengali peasant subsidized the British soldier. The developing Indian economy subsidized the reconstruction of London. It challenges us to rethink the entire history of the 20th century. World War II was a fight against tyranny. It is a good thing the Allies won, but we must be honest about who paid the bill.